Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who lead us furthest from the truth. Not because they're cruel or indifferent, but because they see our pain and want to end it quickly, like pulling out a splinter without checking if something deeper is broken underneath. I learned this watching someone I cared about lose the best relationship she ever had, not to betrayal or distance, but to a single conversation with her best friend. A conversation that felt like rescue, but was actually abandonment of everything she knew to be true. Her name was Eve, and when she walked into my office that first time, years ago now, she wasn't there to talk about what had happened. She was there because she couldn't understand why nothing felt right anymore. Why every relationship after him felt like trying on someone else's clothes. Why she kept waking up at 3 a.m. with this hollow ache in her chest, like she'd left something behind in a house she could never return to. I want you to think about something before we go further. Have you ever made a decision that seemed absolutely right in the moment, supported by everyone around you, logical, even necessary, only to realize months or years later that you'd acted out of fear, dressed up as wisdom? That's what I want to talk about today, because what happened to Eve happens to more people than you might think. And if you've ever wondered whether you made the right choice when you walked away from someone, or if you're standing at that crossroads right now, this story might change how you see everything. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always wonder who's listening, who needs to hear this today. Eve met him in graduate school. His name was Marcus, and he was the kind of person who made a room feel smaller just by entering it, not through arrogance, but through presence. He noticed things. The way she twisted her ring when she was nervous during presentations. How she always sat in the same seat in the library, third table from the window. Small things that most people miss because they're too busy performing their own existence. They were friends first. That's important. For 8 months, they were just two people who studied together, who texted each other at midnight when they couldn't figure out a problem set, who had coffee between classes and talked about everything except what was obviously building between them. Eve told me later that she'd known from the beginning, known that if they crossed that line, it would matter, that it wouldn't be casual or easy or something she could walk away from without leaving pieces of herself behind. When they finally did get together, it was quiet. No grand gesture, no dramatic confession. They were studying at his apartment, and she looked up from her textbook to find him already watching her. And he said simply, "I don't want to pretend anymore that this is just friendship." That's all it took. Everything that had been carefully held in place came undone. For 2 years, they built something. Not perfect, I need you to understand that, but real. They fought sometimes. He could be withdrawn when he was stressed, disappearing into his work for days and forgetting that she needed to hear from him. She could be controlling, wanting to plan everything, to know where they stood at every moment because uncertainty made her anxious. But they worked on it. They talked. They learned each other's languages. Eve's best friend was a woman named Jess. They'd known each other since high school. One of those friendships that survives everything. Distance, life changes, different paths. Jess was sharp, funny, fiercely protective. She'd been there through Eve's previous relationships, the ones that had left bruises on her confidence. The guy who cheated with her roommate. The one who told her she was too needy, too emotional, too much. Jess had held her through all of it, and Eve trusted her completely. Trusted her the way you trust someone who's never let you down when it mattered. Here's where it started, though nobody knew it yet. Marcus got a job offer. A good one, the kind you don't turn down if you're serious about your career. It was across the country, 1,000 miles from where they were building their life. When he told Eve, he was careful about it. He said he wanted her input, that they'd figure it out together, that the relationship mattered more than the job. But Eve heard something else. She heard uncertainty. She heard the possibility that he might go without her, or worse, that he might resent her if he stayed. Have you ever noticed how fear can make you see things that aren't there? How it can take a moment of vulnerability and turn it into evidence of doom? She didn't say any of this to Marcus. Instead, she smiled and told him congratulations, that they'd talk about it more later. But inside, something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the foundation, and she couldn't stop looking at it, couldn't stop imagining it spreading until everything collapsed. She called Jess that night, told her everything, the job offer, her fears, the fact that she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. And Jess, who loved her and wanted to protect her, said what seemed like the most reasonable thing in the world. You need to think about whether you're willing to put your life on hold for someone who might not choose you in the end. That sentence, that single sentence was the spark that would burn everything down. Because here's what happens in the brain when someone you trust validates your deepest fear. Your amygdala, the part of your mind that's always scanning for danger, lights up like a warning flare. Suddenly, what was a possibility becomes a probability. What was anxiety becomes clarity. And the worst part is, it feels like wisdom. It feels like you're finally seeing the truth, instead of the pretty lies you've been telling yourself. Jess kept talking. She reminded Eve of the previous boyfriends, the ones who'd hurt her. She said that Marcus keeping his options open with the job meant he was keeping his options open with the relationship. She said that Eve needed to protect herself, to think about her own future, to not be so quick to sacrifice everything for a man who clearly wasn't willing to do the same. And Eve listened. She listened the way you listen when someone is telling you what you're already afraid is true. When confirmation feels like relief, even though it's actually the opposite. By the time they hung up, Eve had made a decision. She wouldn't wait around to see if Marcus would choose her. She wouldn't make herself small or flexible or accommodating. She would beat him to the ending. She would leave first. She didn't know yet that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she was being strong. She thought she was learning from the past. She thought she was listening to the wisdom of someone who knew her better than anyone. But here's what nobody tells you about getting relationship advice from people who love you. They can only counsel you from their own wounds. Jess wasn't advising Eve. She was protecting the version of Eve she'd held together after those other relationships ended. She was fighting old battles in a new war. And Eve was about to pay the price for that confusion. She broke up with him 3 days later, told him she'd been thinking about the job offer, and realized they wanted different things. That she needed to focus on her own path. That it was better to end it now, before they got in any deeper. Marcus sat there in her apartment, on the couch they'd picked out together, and he didn't argue. He didn't fight or plead, or try to change her mind. He just looked at her with this expression she couldn't quite read, something between confusion and grief, and said, "Is this really what you want?" And Eve, performing strength she didn't feel, said yes. He left, packed up his things over the next week, while she stayed at Jess's place, unable to watch him erase himself from her life. She told herself it was the right decision, that she was being smart, protecting herself, learning from the past. Jess reinforced it constantly. "You did the right thing," she said. "You can't put your life on hold for someone else's dreams." But something was wrong. Eve felt it immediately, though she couldn't name it. It wasn't relief. It wasn't freedom. It was this creeping emptiness, like she'd amputated a healthy limb because she was afraid it might get infected someday. Marcus took the job, moved across the country, and for 3 months, Eve threw herself into her own life, her work, her friends, her routines. She dated other people, went through the motions of moving on, but nothing stuck. Nothing felt right. Every man she met was compared to Marcus and found wanting, not because they were worse people, but because they weren't him. They didn't know her the way he had. They didn't see her. Here's what was happening beneath the surface, what Eve couldn't understand yet. She had acted from a place of trauma, not truth. When we've been hurt before, our nervous system develops what psychologists call hypervigilance. We start seeing danger everywhere, even in safe situations. It's like an alarm system that's been tripped so many times it can't tell the difference between an intruder and the wind rattling a window. Eve's previous relationships had taught her nervous system that vulnerability leads to pain. So when Marcus showed any hint of uncertainty, even healthy, normal uncertainty about a major life decision, her alarm went off. And Jess, meaning well, had amplified it instead of helping her investigate whether the danger was real. The breaking point came 4 months after the breakup. Eve was having coffee with another friend, someone who hadn't been part of the decision, who didn't know the whole story. And this friend mentioned seeing Marcus at a conference, talking about his new job. She said he'd seemed good, but sad. And then she said, almost casually, he mentioned he'd been planning to ask you to come with him. That he'd been looking into jobs for you out there before you broke up. The world stopped. Eve sat there with her coffee getting cold, and everything she thought she knew rearranged itself. Marcus hadn't been keeping his options open. He'd been trying to include her in his options. He'd been planning for them, not just for himself. And she had interpreted his careful approach, his desire to discuss it rather than demand it, as hesitation, as lack of commitment. She had mistaken thoughtfulness for indifference. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed replaying every conversation, every moment of those last few weeks before she ended it. And she saw them differently now. She saw him trying to navigate a difficult situation carefully, trying to include her in the decision, trying to do the right thing. And she saw herself performing strength, proving she didn't need him, beating him to the punch on an abandonment that had never been coming. The grief hit her like a physical thing. It wasn't just sadness, it was rage at herself, at Jess, at the past relationships that had taught her to see love as a trap instead of a gift. It was the specific, unbearable pain of knowing you destroyed something precious because you were too afraid to trust it. Have you ever experienced that? The moment you realized the ending could have been avoided? That you weren't protecting yourself. You were running from something real because you'd learned to mistake real for dangerous? She called Jess, told her what she'd learned. And Jess, to her credit, was horrified. She apologized immediately, said she'd had no idea, that she'd only been trying to protect Eve from getting hurt again. But the damage was done. Eve heard the words differently now. She heard someone projecting their own fears onto her situation. Someone who'd never seen Marcus clearly because they were too busy looking at Eve's scars. This is where I want you to understand something crucial about relationship advice. The people who love us can only see us through the lens of what they know. If they've only seen us hurt, they'll expect hurt. If they've never experienced secure love themselves, they won't recognize it when we find it. They'll mistake care for control, thoughtfulness for manipulation, healthy interdependence for codependency. Jess had been operating from love, but love without wisdom can be just as destructive as indifference. Eve knew she needed to try to fix this. She reached out to Marcus, sent him a long email explaining everything. What she'd learned, what she'd been afraid of, how she'd let past hurt contaminate something new. She apologized. She asked if they could talk. He didn't respond for 2 weeks. When he finally did, his message was kind but clear. He said he understood, that he didn't blame her, but that the breakup had shown him something important, that she didn't trust him, or maybe didn't trust herself enough to be vulnerable with him. That he couldn't build a life with someone who was always waiting for the bottom to drop out. He was right. That was the worst part. She couldn't even argue with him because everything he said was true. They met for coffee once, a few weeks later when he was in town visiting family. It was civil, even warm. But it was also final. You know how sometimes you can feel the distance between who you were together and who you are now as separate people? It was like that. Like looking at a photograph of a house that's been torn down. The memory is clear, but the reality is gone. Eve told me, when she finally came to therapy months after all this happened, that the worst part wasn't losing him. It was knowing that she'd been the one who'd chosen to walk away. That she'd had something real and had thrown it away because she'd been more committed to her fear than to the relationship. So what happened to Eve after that? Because this isn't one of those stories where everything magically gets better or where the two people find their way back to each other. Life doesn't usually work like that. Real healing is messier and slower and less cinematic than we want it to be. Eve spent the next year in therapy working through what had happened. Not just with Marcus, but with all of it, the pattern of choosing wrong, of self-sabotaging, of letting fear drive decisions that should have been driven by clarity. She had to learn to recognize the difference between intuition and anxiety, between wisdom and trauma response. Here's what she discovered, and what I want you to really hear. There's a difference between protecting yourself and punishing the present for the crimes of the past. When we've been hurt, especially repeatedly, we develop what feels like a sophisticated early warning system. We think we're getting better at spotting red flags, but often we're just getting better at finding reasons to run. Real discernment, the kind that actually protects us, requires that we slow down, that we investigate our reactions instead of immediately trusting them, that we ask ourselves, am I responding to what's actually happening right now, or am I responding to what happened before? Eve learned to do that work. She learned to sit with uncertainty without making it mean abandonment. She learned that someone showing vulnerability about a difficult decision doesn't mean they're planning to leave you. It might mean they respect you enough to be honest about the complexity. And she learned something else, something that changed how she thought about friendship and advice. She learned that the people who love us most aren't always the people who can guide us best. That sometimes, in their desire to protect us from pain, they keep us from everything that matters. Jess had meant well, but she had given advice from her own fear, not from Eve's truth. Eve and Jess are still friends, but their relationship changed. Eve learned to take advice with more discernment, to understand that everyone speaks from their own wounds and experiences. She learned to check advice against her own inner knowing, to ask herself whether what someone is telling her matches what she actually experiences when she's with someone. As for Marcus, Eve heard through mutual friends that he eventually met someone else, got married, seems happy, and Eve told me that learning this didn't devastate her the way she'd expected it to. It hurt, yes, but it also released her from something, from the fantasy that maybe someday they'd find their way back to each other. It let her fully grieve what was lost and move forward without that thread of hope keeping her tied to the past. She's dating someone now, has been for about 6 months, and she says it's different this time. Not because this person is perfect or because there are no challenges, but because she's different. She catches herself when she starts to spiral, when fear tries to convince her that care is control or that vulnerability is weakness. She does the work to stay present instead of running. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you're in a relationship right now and you're feeling uncertain, afraid, caught between staying and going, don't make major decisions from a place of panic. Don't let other people's fears become your roadmap. Take time. Get quiet. Ask yourself what's actually happening versus what you're afraid might happen. And if you're the friend, the person someone comes to for advice when they're hurting or confused, please remember that your job isn't to protect them from pain. Your job is to help them see clearly, to ask questions instead of giving answers, to help them distinguish between their intuition and their trauma response. Some of the best advice I ever heard came from a mentor of mine who used to say, don't make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. Eve's fear was temporary. It was real and it was loud, but it wasn't the truth of her situation. And because she acted from that fear, she lost something that might have been permanent. That's not to say we should stay in every relationship, ignore our concerns, or override our instincts. There are absolutely times when we need to leave, when the relationship isn't healthy, when someone is showing us through their actions that they're not capable of the partnership we need. But we have to be able to tell the difference between a relationship that's actually failing and a relationship that's just asking us to trust more than we're comfortable trusting. Eve says now that if she could go back, she would have talked to Marcus about her fears instead of running from them. She would have said, I'm scared that this job means you're pulling away from us. I'm scared that I'm going to end up alone again. She would have given him the chance to reassure her, to show her his plans, to let her see that she was part of his future, not separate from it. But she didn't. She protected herself right out of the relationship she wanted most. I think about Eve's story often when people come to me struggling with relationships. I think about how much we lose when we let fear make our decisions. How many good people we push away because we're still fighting battles from relationships that ended years ago. Your past will always try to teach you about your present. That's normal. That's how memory works. But you have to be the one who decides whether the lessons from your past actually apply to what's happening now. You have to be the one who chooses whether to run or to stay, to trust or to protect, to risk or to hide. Eve learned this the hard way. And I'm sharing her story with you, so maybe you won't have to. So maybe the next time fear tells you to leave, you'll take a moment. You'll breathe. You'll ask yourself whether you're responding to what's real or what you're afraid of. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do isn't leaving. It's staying. It's trusting. It's saying, I'm scared, but I'm here anyway. And sometimes the people who love us most will try to talk us out of that bravery. They'll call it naivety or foolishness or setting ourselves up for pain. But they can't see what you see. They can't feel what you feel when you're with that person. Only you know if what you have is worth the risk. I hope Eve's story helps you know the difference. I hope it helps you trust yourself a little more and other people's fears a little less. Tell me in the comments, have you ever let someone else's advice lead you away from something you knew was right? Or have you been the friend who gave advice you later regretted? I read every comment. Your stories matter. They help other people feel less alone. And wherever you are right now, whether you're holding on or letting go, whether you're afraid or certain, whether you're healing from something you lost or building something new, I hope you give yourself permission to trust what you know. Not what you fear, not what everyone else thinks, but what you actually know deep down when you get quiet enough to hear it. That's where wisdom lives, not in the loudest voice or the strongest opinion, but in that quiet knowing that only you can hear. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for trusting me with your time and attention. It means more than you know.